Go ahead.
All right. Welcome to the Wednesday, April 9, 2014 Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. Nels, when you were speaking with the students, did you explain to them that the A row's up front and the B row's next?
Well, they don't know they're getting B's tonight, yes. Okay. They didn't sit in the A row.
Welcome to our student audience tonight. The first item on our agenda is approval of the minutes from March 26.
Move to accept.
Okay.
Second.
Kurt, and I have a second. Any corrections or other comments?
The only question I have, this is probably more due to my faulty memory, in Section 5 where we talked about the proposed funeral home mortuary code amendment, I thought it says commissioners agreed to include mortuaries as a permitted use in the GB district but leave the CUP requirements in CD. I thought the recommendation had been to make them a permitted use in both. Does everybody else remember that differently than I do?
I think I remember it differently than you do. That is, what I remember was it started out as a CUP in general business but permitted in neighborhood. And I thought that was a little lopsided, but it started out as a CUP in central business. And I think the rationale I would understand for that was simply solving the parking problem in central business.
Okay. I knew we had had some discussion and moved something on it, and I just didn't remember which. But if the collective memory is different than mine, I'll certainly go with the collective memory.
Okay. Does that fit others' memory? Okay. Other comments? All in favor of approving the minutes of March 26th? Say aye.
Aye.
Opposed and abstentions? Wendy and Debbie. Thank you. All right. Next up, correspondence. Anything from staff?
Nothing from staff.
Anything from the group? I wanted just to note the Moscow on the Move transportation plan is still open for public comment. And you can find the plan on the city website. Quite an extensive set of documents, but if you missed the open house about a week ago, it was here. You could still look at that. Do we know how long people have to
I don't
make
know
comments?
that has actually been defined by the Public Works Department. I think they were talking about a month initially, but I understood they were going to be defining a date and putting a press release out, but I haven't seen anything yet.
John, any clue when you're going to act on it?
No.
Okay.
The mayor and Gary have not
Set it on the agenda.
put it
anyway.
on the agenda.
Okay. So probably people have 2 weeks at least, and maybe a month.
Yeah, I think they were waiting to understand the anticipated comment period before setting it on the council agenda.
Okay. The second correspondence bit is sort of a personal note. Last night, I accepted a position on the Moscow Affordable Housing Trust as a director, and which is their staff. And there is the potential that the Housing Trust would bring forward a land use action, in which case I will be handing Wendy the gavel and recusing myself to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest. So just so that Wendy's braced for it, should it happen. And then my third thing is just to put out again the invitation for identifying any readings that you might think are interesting for the group, to send them to Bill, and then at our meeting later this month, I'll put out a call just if you have any reactions, want to talk about them.
Nils, on that note, I got a chance to start reading some of the correspondence, or the readings from March, and they were very informative with lots of good rabbit trails to follow, so I'd encourage everybody to jump on that.
Thank you. Transportation Commission, Joel?
At our last meeting of this commission, I reported on the activities of the Transportation Commission last meeting, and the meeting of the commission, the next meeting has been canceled, and so the next meeting of the Transportation Commission will be in early May.
Okay. We've now reached the point in the agenda called open microphone, where members of the public may speak to the Planning and Zoning Commission on matters that are not currently on the agenda or pending before Planning and Zoning. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to step up and say your name and address and share something that's on your mind?
Now, how much extra credit do you get?
They get an A if they get up and do that.
Here we go, we've got one taker. All right. But again, as a reminder to our television audience, this is your chance to come down and share what you're thinking with us. ADU's second open house meeting report. Bill?
So, as the Commission is aware, we conducted a second public open house meeting on the topic of accessory dwelling units on April 2nd from 5 to 6:30 in this room. So that was just last week. We had a number of poster stations. I think the first 5 or so were from the prior meeting, just provide background to anybody who had not attended the prior meeting. And then we presented 2 options looking at ADUs, one that was kind of a more restrictive option, one that was a more permissive option, and looking for feedback and input on those. The more permissive would allow them as an accessory use in all zoning districts. The more restrictive would have only allowed them in the R3 and R4, and maybe by conditional use permit in the R1 and the R2. And then we asked questions about relative, a variety of aspects, whether it's off-street parking or design considerations or size limitations or occupant limitations, trying to give on the spectrum of more restrictive and more permissive options available there that individuals could identify that they felt would be appropriate. We had a lower turnout. I think we had maybe 35 or 40 at the first open house meeting. I think we had 10, 12 at the second open house, so we had a really pretty light turnout, unfortunately. So we do have, and we developed a survey instrument to kind of collect information where a respondent can check a box on either side as they look down those different options. So you didn't have to select the same option, complete option 1. You kind of had a menu that you could choose from. Parking, maybe you thought they should be allowed in all zones, but parking should be required. So you could kind of go back and forth on those options. So we had that. We updated the project website, put the PDFs of the meeting posters up there, and also are running that survey online right now. We're going to put out another press release on Friday this week to encourage people to participate. We have had a little bit of an interesting results so far, in that we had a total of 28 responses that we had collected in the last go-around when we presented the charts. We actually had a few stragglers come in because they hadn't been pulled off the website. We incorporated that and really didn't change the results for the first survey document that we did. But I think of the 28 that we compiled, we had about half were in person from the open house meeting, the first one, and half were completed online. We had about 3 or 4 that were completed at the open house meeting on April 2nd, and we now have 190 responses online.
Wow.
All 98% of them all on the less restrictive model.
Meaning they supported it or didn't support it?
They supported it in the most permissive way possible. We understand there has been some communication going on among some groups trying to promote people to respond, and so I don't know that that's necessarily representative of the whole community. And so I think We had a low response in the first one, probably, and we talked about the fact that we did have a relatively small number of people that filled it out, but the overall distribution of the responses that were supportive or less supportive were fairly consistent with the citizen survey responses overall. The second go-around looks like it's getting pushed to one side, obviously by some group of people that are looking to influence the outcome. So that's going to reduce the validity or the value of the results, because it's obviously going to appear that it is, looking at the citizen survey results and comparing to this is obviously something doesn't mesh here. Somebody is actively trying to push the scores in a certain direction. So,
And are those many similar, you see a similarity between a number of the responses?
yes, and in this one, it is all of them picking the least restrictive options, and just the volume. I mean, we had, like I said, about 22 or 24 online responses last time, and now it's 190 within a few days,
that's really
and
weird.
all pushing in a certain direction. So that's going to obviously create concern about the validity, and can you extrapolate that result to the broader community as a whole, which is what we're trying to achieve. And so, Nils asked a couple questions about doing a random sample survey like we do with the citizen survey, and what would that cost? What would it look like? How many would we put out? And so I did have that spreadsheet if you want to take a look at it, just to kind of talk about trying to understand I should have opened it first, but trying to get a more uniform sense that can be extrapolated within some reasonable range that is truly representative of the community. And so the city does, every 2 years, the city completes and conducts a citizen survey and asks the community's opinion upon a variety of public services, quality of life measures, city services, and then the commissions have an opportunity to present a question or two on the survey as well. In that process, we send out 1,200 survey instruments. Our response rate is in the low to mid 30% rate. I think it was 33% in the 2012 citizen survey. And that generally gets us a sample size that's somewhere approaching 400. And when you're looking at, and this is kind of delving back into statistics, which I haven't had for quite some time, but when you were looking at doing a survey, the sample size is very important. It's probably one of the most important aspects. The population size you're sampling from is kind of, it really doesn't matter, but that sample size does drive two things, your margin of error and your confidence interval. And so if you want to say that if you were to have a 95% confidence interval with a margin of error of 5%, you generally need a sample size of about 400 is typically the number that you really need to shoot for. And that then tells you that you will get a response on the question, and if a percentage is 65%, that and the margin of error is 5%, that you would expect that the actual population is going to respond either to 60% or 70%, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, if that is your confidence interval. And so those two criteria really do drive what the sample size needs to be, and I'm going to make this a little bit larger. So if you were to think of, and just to show how large it goes, if this at a 95% confidence interval and a standard deviation of 0.5 is probably your worst case scenario, that means that you're equally divided on either sides of the question. If you wanted to shoot for a margin of error of 2%, then your sample size would need to be 2,401 in your sample. If you were to shoot the margin of error to 10%, it drops to 96. And so the margin of error is a large driver in what sample size you're looking for. The confidence interval, 95% is typically the standard. You can live with maybe a slightly larger confidence interval, and that does help reduce the size. So if you look at these two, this is a 95% confidence interval with a 5% margin of error. The response rate here Like I said, we do have typically a low 30% response, so from that and what you need for the sample, you can extrapolate how many you need to send out to get back your required sample. If we were to assume a 25% response rate, slightly lower because it's somewhat of a single issue survey rather than a broader community survey. If you were doing a 95% confidence interval with a 5% margin of error and estimating a 25% response rate, which is still a pretty high response rate for a mail survey, typically 10% is what you look at. But if we assume a 25% response, then you need to mail out 1,537 pieces. It is about $1.15 each to produce stuff mail, not counting any type of labor, but postage. You'll include a postage paid return envelope. You'll pay for the postage for it going out, and the envelope, the paper, the copying, production of the survey instrument. So in that instance, you'd be looking at about $1,751 to conduct a survey that would, if your response rate is 25%, would provide you a sample size of 384. And that would give you results that have a 5% margin of error at a 95% confidence interval. And that's about what we do for the citizen survey. We actually have, let's say, that 34% response rate. And then we have typically, 1% or so that come back undeliverable, units unoccupied. So you get a certain number out. So when we do 1,200, we're in that 380 to 365 to 400 range on the results. And so, this is just material and postage and doesn't include any labor for the actual copying and production or for the data entry when you get typically a surveys back. And on a 8-page citizen survey, I've had folks in here on a Saturday when I used to run that, and it'd take us a couple, 2-3 days, 3 or 4 people doing data entry straight to enter that into the system. Something of this scale would obviously be much less, depending upon what the survey instrument looked like and how many questions were asked. The data entry could be certainly much less than that. The bottom sample here was just if you were to go to 90% confidence interval with a 6 or 7% margin of error. Again, with a 25% response rate, your sample size drops down to 188, which is 752 going out. You probably round up to 800, but that's about $856 in production and postage cost.
I have just a little question about it. Does it make better sense to do some kind of a survey on a very specific thing, or might it be wise to let the particular piece of legislation or ordinance that we're looking for, just let it drift for a few months until we're doing a more general one and embed that in the more general, and we do it, every a couple of years, and I just wonder what kind of different response you get when it's just part of a whole thing, as opposed to acting like it's something, here's a big deal that we really have to pay attention to. I'm not saying this isn't a big deal, but I don't feel it is, but I wouldn't want to say so.
We do have the 2014 citizen survey coming up that will be mailing in September or October timeframe. The commission, I'm sure, will be asked to provide questions, and so we'll have an opportunity to provide a question or two. The difficulty you run into is you just have limited real estate on the survey instrument to convey much information.
Right.
And something like this, in order to get a good response, probably requires a fair amount of sharing of some information about what an accessory dwelling unit is. We tried to provide about a 2-sentence summary in the 2012 survey, but if you were doing a separate survey instrument, it would allow you a greater opportunity to provide more information. You could also do two things where if you did a smaller targeted survey on the single issue, accepting a larger margin of error or a lower confidence interval, and asking the question with that background information, you can ask the same question as part of the citizen survey and see how it correlates. So you can use a smaller sample size that maybe has a wider range of error, but allows you the opportunity to provide more information. and then ask that same question on the citizen survey and see if you can correlate that the responses were similar from that larger sample size, and extrapolate that maybe your margin of error was smaller or was even on your smaller sample, it was representative of the population as a whole. So those are two options to look at. Nils did ask to take a look at what budget, and we'll talk about the budget request coming up for the next fiscal year. But the commission had a budget of about $1,400 for the current fiscal year, and it was broken out into about, I guess, $1,500 for $900 for professional development opportunities. That was if a commission member wanted to attend a conference or training or some other event that was happening that we could, or other type of professional development or publication materials. And then there was $600 that was identified for hosting 2 APA audio web conference events, which we have not done this year because we were having kind of a fairly low turnout when we were sponsoring those, and so we have not done that. So there was $1,500 that was budgeted for the current fiscal year, and so far we have spent $86. About 40-some was a going-away gift to Art, and another $20 charge for a new nameplate for
Now I
new
know
members.
why Wayne told me that our budget for Moscow Historic Preservation Commission is considered so large.
Relative to other commissions, it is.
Does this mean we could have coffee at the meetings?
When we get to that budget item, you won't be here to enjoy it.
If all goes well. So I'll just report, that is currently what is
Well,
in
the county's
the
big on coffee.
commission's budget, and just,
Is that the only way to finance doing this?
well, we have to find a funding source in the city budget, and so either it'd be something that would come out of our department's line item or the commission's line item, and that would be, or, outside of going to the council and asking the council to fund it out of some other resource that would be available. I think the commission, because it's related to a planning activity and a consideration of the code amendment, would be the appropriate place. But whether we want to pursue that or not, I think we need to think through. We generally have not done this historically in the past of going to the extent of conducting a survey on a topic, but this is one that might be worth doing. Looking at Missoula's approach, they did do a broad random survey. There's another cost that's not included in here, and traditionally we collect our sample by buying a residential mailing list. So you can purchase for about under $200. That gives you all certified mailing addresses within a certain zip code. We would then generally we'll geocode them so that we can clip out areas that are outside the city limit boundary. We then typically assign a random number, just an Excel spreadsheet, to all of them, and then we grab then sort them numerically and then grab that top. And that's how we get it. Then we will map those out again and make sure that the sample looks like it's well distributed around the community. And so that's the process we go through to grab that random sample. And so I would anticipate if we're going to do something, that would be the same process we would engage here. It's not that difficult to do.
Sure.
Is there some way to code them accurately by zoning district?
We could. The citizen surveys end up color-coded. So we try not to do any type of barcodes or anything that really can tie it to an individual property or respondent. When we do the citizen survey, we want to make it anonymous. We do have survey quadrants. There's about 7 different quadrants, and we kind of divide up in the city to make sure that people have the same level of satisfaction with snow removal in one area of the city to another, to see if we're making sure that we're providing equal services. And we could look at color coding the survey instruments by zoning district. I mean, we just spatially join it in GIS to pull that attribute out and then color code them. So that can be done. That could be done, and that would help avoid errors of people not knowing necessarily what zoning district they reside within, and have to avoid that question.
You had a further follow-up?
No, but I think it might be a good idea. That's one of the questions that we've had in trying to interpret the results we've gotten so far is
Yeah.
uncertainty as to whether people were accurate in their thing, which district they're in.
But if you really want to know how the average citizen of the community feels about the topic, this is the way to go about it, and to have, statistically valid information that you can utilize in making policy decisions, that the council can utilize in making policy decisions.
Just make one comment, is that, well, if there is an organized group out there that's trying to push it a certain direction, well, at least they care enough to get involved and, are making their voices heard, where otherwise we're getting 28 responses. So, I don't think that's actually a reason to automatically kind of disregard them, because it's not really a random survey or anything. I mean, there's a pretty healthy number of people that care enough about it to make their voices heard.
The counter argument is it could be one guy.
Yeah, is there any way that could happen?
Is it possible that you can, the same person can multiple respond?
Yeah.
Or does it have to be from a different computer every
It
time?
has to be from a different IP address, I believe, is what is the limitation. We had that problem internally because we took the hard copies and we wanted just to go ahead and enter them into, actually Dan asked her to enter them into SurveyMonkey, and she got one in and then said, you're done. So if you find different machines, I'm sure if you're up at the U of I Computer Lab, or I'm sure you could find a way around it if you're technically savvy enough. But it does tend
Could be done, but not particularly easily.
It's not
like
casual.
Yeah, it's not just that there.
one person can't sit and enter 30 different, or 190.
So I had sort of two goals that I think are intertwined for this conversation. One was to talk about the schedule in which we would like to carry through the rest of this process. At the open house, Bill had a sort of tentative fast-track schedule that would have us holding hearings maybe in July, if I'm remembering, and the council holding hearings in August. I'll put out my personal piece here. I have a certain amount of concern that if we do this in the middle of the summer, that there may be a perception that we did it in the middle of the summer. Then that ties with the question, which was, I didn't know about the 198 responses when I started asking Bill about the possibility of doing a mailed survey. But rather, I was reacting to what seemed to be a maybe more polarized small group that had come. Yeah. And just the concern, again, that this is a question that has the whole city as a constituency in a way that many of the things that we address don't. And in some sense, it's vaguer what the nature of the city is than when we're talking about a rezone or something. We can more concretely look at what's on the ground and how it might affect the immediate neighborhood. This could affect everybody's immediate neighbor. So it was in those contexts that I thought, well, if we were to actually push out until fall to do this work, and I don't think there's an urgency to get it done, we would have a window in which we could think about, could we get some better data than the strategy that we've employed so far. So that would be what I'd like to hear you think about. Schedule, sort of fast track or slower, and do you want to invest? It sounds like we have the budget. It's not, the line items aren't described the way we would spend it, but I doubt that that's a major hurdle. The $1,200 kind of cost, it seems like it's within the range of what we could afford, or we could choose a slightly cheaper one. We'd have to choose the dollar amount first. Let's say schedule, and should we do a survey, and then we'll see where we are.
Well, I'm kind of with you after showing up, particularly to the second workshop when it was so poorly attended, and it's like there's a tendency to hang on every word that one attendee might say, and it just seemed like it was skewing the whole I would hate to make any informed decision based on the level of participation that we saw at that last workshop. And so it's either we just go for it and we go ahead and move and have a public hearing and just say we've researched this, maybe we should just put it out there and see how people feel and risk maybe not getting as accurate a tap of how the community feels or not, or we recoil and do the survey, and then you have maybe more solid grounds to understand how to make a decision, how to even craft. If we assume that we probably are going to go forward with some kind of proposal, it helps to see where the tone is in terms of which way that's going to be, and whether it's going to be less restricted or more restricted, and et cetera. But I just found the conversation was a little bit arbitrary at that last workshop. It was like, yeah, well, we shouldn't have 14-foot plate heights. Well, maybe you're looking at a drawing that's going up two stories and then sloping up, and you're not understanding that. And so I mean, just as one example, and so it started to concern me that we would react too much to that input, and that we needed either a broader base, or we needed to just have the confidence to say, well, we've tried these different venues, and maybe we should just see if we can make good decisions.
A couple of things come to one's mind. One of the intriguing questions that I can't quite get my hands around is the ADU issue deals with a certain percentage of people in the city who have either larger lots or standalone garages, which in modern times, standalone garages are not. So you can almost say that houses built between 1975 and 90, at least for a period of time, there were no standalone garages. We're now looking at them again. So it changes the nature of just saying, yeah, it's for everybody in the city, because there are certain areas of the city that really have a great, I mean, in the inner Moscow, we have just hundreds of examples of separate garages that have opportunities for a little something on top of it. Many people have taken, in modern terms, have put their garage right next to their living room inside the house, so that you don't even have to step out of the house to get to your garage. And oftentimes, as the lots have gotten smaller, there aren't many options for people, unless you're luckily have maybe our one people have an option, but I'm not even sure we're impacting them. So that's one issue that I haven't been able to quite deal with. And the other one, with regard to the 100 and some people who, those groups are a little bit like having a hearing, which all of us who've been around here for 15 or 20 years know about. But we have a hearing, and 50 people come to the hearing, and 40 of them say no, and the body, the city council says, no, sorry, but we've been thinking about this, for the last 3 years, and we'll have to do it anyway. In other words, just because 40 people said no, we've never, at least I haven't observed that the city council only occasionally, and planning and zoning the same way, only occasionally immediately reacts to the fact that the percentage of any little given group of 20 or 30 attendees said no or yes. We usually listen to as much information as we can get, glean that, and ask questions, and then continue to vote, because we know that the people on the other side of town didn't come to the thing because it didn't really impact them. We knew that. So anyway, those are just two things that as we work on this, it's quite interesting, I must say. It's an intriguing thing. We'll surely look for your guidance, John.
My only rejoinder would be, daylight basements, there are other solutions besides a standalone structure, which might expand the number of
users.
potential
Sure,
users.
potential. Right, that's a good point.
So, yeah, I'd say that it can potentially affect every residential area. And so I agree with what you said. It's a big enough potential impact that it would be worth getting some really good data on it. If we wanted to try to do it really on the cheap, I myself would think that if we had some survey results, even with a 10% error rate, I think that would be pretty helpful.
Well, especially when you fold in staff time to process the results.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, the cost will be certainly on our...
Yeah.
In the two prior meetings we've had on this since I've been on the commission, my understanding was that the 2012 survey was within the 2 or 3%, Bill, is that right? The statistical margin of error?
It would be at least a 5% margin of error and 95% confidence interval with a sample size of just under 400.
Yeah. And from my looking at that, I was satisfied that even though it might not have been the perfect survey and there might have been some information that was missing or we wanted more detail on, that it was sufficient to move forward. I think that I'm not sure we would get much more from spending money on another survey. I look at the 190 responses or whatever. I put all that together with the open house. I mean, I look at that as those same thing as those people showing up at the open house and expressing an opinion there. They just, instead of doing that, did it in a survey. And you can probably take that for what it's worth. But I think we've got enough information to move forward. I do agree it should be done after summer when we're going to get a
slow schedule, but no survey, I think is what I just heard.
Right.
Bill, could you pull up the survey instrument so that folks can get an idea of the set of choices that we were trying to ask about?
Yeah, that was kind of one thing I was thinking was that survey, although it was good information, was a pretty general question. And like now we're getting down to a lot more specific things.
And the reason I asked to see the instrument was when we last really talked about this, there were some things that you were clear on. And there were some things that the group was a bit split on in terms of the choice. And at first I think Bill was grimacing that we were not going down one path. But that sort of led me to think after the meeting, maybe we're at the point of having a half a dozen things where we still seem to be a little bit unsure, and maybe the public can provide us some specific input on a few of those things. And then staff were able to give the survey instrument that we had at the last thing.
I would agree with you and Wendy, slow.
Okay.
And I also think we should do the survey. It's always people with a vested interest that make the most noise, whether it's vocally or on paper or online. And I don't think that is a really good representation of what the community as a whole would have to say.
Okay, so we got. I think we're headed. Let's just try this. Mm-hmm. Is there any reason to not be slow?
No, I don't think there's any urgency.
No one's come forth and say I got to put one of these in there next week for my mother-in-law.
Well, as a matter of fact, but I'm willing to go slow.
It's possible still right now, isn't it?
Unless my son can move in with you guys.
You just need a little bit of extra help from staff and maybe going to Board of Adjustment, huh?
Yeah, I don't know if you could Well, you could do the guest house, Wendy, just...
I know.
Can't he just share your bedroom with you? And gee, Mom, I'm home.
Exactly.
So-
That's the trouble.
So the other, since at the last the meeting prior to the open house, I don't need us to be unanimous. It's okay by me if we were to go down that list and have a split vote. I think this is a strong enough team that we will work together subsequently. But I think there's some differences in opinion about some of the choices. And I was hoping to get more information to help settle that out. And so that's why I was hoping at the open house to get some of that, and now I'm kind of pushing for getting, okay, and here's the survey. So there are sort of 2 columns, choose one of, in each row, choose something.
And this is what was available at the recent open house?
Yeah. Yeah, this was the kind of questionnaire or survey that we provided.
There was that kind of unfortunate typo on the second one on option 2.
Yeah, we hand corrected that one on the instruments we had on site.
Should be whichever is lesser.
Yeah.
Right.
Whichever is less. Yeah. So we had corrected that by hand on them.
Yeah, I see so we'd never get this many questions in the big general one, would we? We'd never get anything this clarifying.
Sure. Just targeted,
I should have been able to think that out myself. I remember, because commissions, we try and get stuff in it, and you can get one sentence. Question.
All right, John.
Two things. It may be possible to have more than one survey in the envelope. Maybe.
Yes.
Which, and then the other thing,
Or are you suggesting that the citizen survey and this ride together?
yeah, when you get you open and there's 2 surveys in there, and
Okay.
that would,
Might squeeze some costs down.
yeah, that would help squeeze costs, especially if you're going to come to the council and ask for money.
I wasn't planning on it.
Okay.
If you're willing, I'll do that.
No, I know if I get blown away with too many surveys, I just go, I don't have time.
That's right.
That
I'd
would be
bad
my
for both.
concern there. It's like, okay, there's 2 of these to fill out?
So, interesting
Yeah.
thought, though. We might,
And then a question, since I've only been the council liaison since the first part of the year, have you guys given a lot of thought or any thought at all to that if and when something like this happens, that you are essentially turning every R1 and R2 lot in town into an R3 lot?
We have talked about that quite a bit, and it's like, that was actually one of the big things, was how do we get this set up so it's not the let 1,000 duplexes bloom ordinance. And that's where the size limits are coming in, and a lot of the other kind of nuances of the thing.
The owner-occupied
Yeah,
thing is a big
owner-occupied.
deal, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the square footage limit.
My sense on the whole thing is that, in general, people are in favor of this, and it comes down to the smaller details like the design review, I think, is going to be the main thing that people are going to have trouble with. You know, if, I can build a garage right now next to my house, and there's no design review on that. I can build a storage shed, there's no design review. So why the design review on this? And that becomes and it's a very subjective thing, and it has potential for abuse. And so I think that's the main sticking point in my mind. Like I could, obviously, there's lots of this goes on already, so especially in existing structures.
In the interest of moving it along, I think I'm going to kind of call for a question on should we do a survey? And if you want, just go around and kind of say something, or I can just kind of do it as a vote. But I think we've talked about the issue.
I'll say, yeah, it would be a good idea, but we should strive to do it on the cheap.
Okay.
Like, as in, maybe a smaller survey size, maybe piggybacking at whatever.
Under 1,000 is on the cheap?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
I'd say no survey.
No survey? Okay.
Yeah, I think I support a survey, and I guess I support going relatively slow. My suspicion, well, we've talked about the fact that there's a polarization, and my suspicion still is that the polarization is probably related to zones that people live in. And I would like to see a survey that actually gave us some information on that.
Clear data, which goes back to your earlier question.
Right.
Could staff color code them to get that?
Right.
Wendy, yes?
I'm somewhat ambivalent on the survey. I almost think we could move forward, but at a slow pace, but I also think a survey could be valuable. So I'm certainly supportive of it.
Yeah, I'm going to vote for the survey as well. I'm reminded of just how many questions are on that. I think it's useful.
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
I'm going to say I don't think we need the survey.
Like, one more comment. That is, if we were to take the relatively conservative route in designing an ordinance, I would be willing I'd be willing to vote on it tonight. But to go with the less restrictive, I'd like more survey evidence to support that.
Well, I'd like to go with the less restrictive, so. Okay, it sounds like the balance is in favor of doing the survey. It sounds like we're on a slower track. I haven't heard anybody argue for doing an expensive survey, so we'll pick something that targets getting under $1,000.
Well, it may partly relate to getting some proper sample size within the zones.
Right. I don't think
stratification might.
Yeah. I don't see the A and B on cost. If we do a survey, I would think staff would work as hard as they could to do a good job with it, and I can't imagine that there's going to be many choices. So I think talking about the cheaper survey is just a eyewash, I think, personally.
So this is really...
We're either going to do it and we can barely afford it, we're just a little town and we only have a little money, as Councilman will remind us. So we have to do an inexpensive survey.
And you're only, this is probably an obvious question, but you're only sending it out to residential zones, right? So we don't get ridiculous information from commercial districts or other parts
Right,
of it.
and we typically send it to all residential mailing addresses in the city.
Okay.
We may exclude out, in this case, we have residential addresses in the downtown core.
Right.
We may exclude those in this, for this exercise. We'd probably take out the CEB. We'll take out all the commercial districts.
Right.
We have some residential uses in some commercial districts, but not a ton.
Yeah.
And so we can certainly make sure the sample is
At least targeting that residential zone.
and if we were to purchase the mailing list this summer, then it would still be usable. So I can talk with Jen in administration so that we either have them purchase it and we can share the mailing list. That way we've got some shared cost there.
All right. Thank you all for a careful, thoughtful discussion. Moving on to discussion regarding mobile food vending. I'll tell you why this came up. It started, I was looking for readings, and readings around things of revitalizing downtown, stimulating Legacy Crossing area, etc. And found a couple of different ones on food trucks. One was kind of an economic development strategy, even of getting a group of them together in a food court.
Sort of pods, yeah.
And then evolving that towards some small-scale brick and mortar rentable spaces that food truck operators could graduate to potentially. At any rate, so I passed that to Bill as sort of a question and a direction for a reading, and I think that there were some conversations already going on in staff that I was unaware of.
We've been talking about the concept, whether it's food trucks, whether it's small-scale micro restaurants, for, well, ever since Patty's first started up years ago, about 12 years ago, I guess it would have been. And so we've been talking about that for quite some time. We have a bit of an oddity in the Central Business District, and essentially when you're looking at eating and drinking establishments as a permitted use in the Central Business District, it pretty much speaks to those catering to on-premise consumption. And so I should actually just give the exact language so we're clear. But in the CB district, it also appears in the General Business District. It refers to eating and drinking establishments catering primarily to on-premise consumers. And that's the specific language. And then you get into underneath conditionally permitted uses, you have establishments providing food primarily for takeout or delivery as a conditionally permitted use. And I think we processed Patty's initially under a CUP because it was just kind of an individualized stand. Now, that business grew over time to where fixed seating was installed and a covered structure was placed, and it kind of grew over time. But we have encountered this in multiple occasions in the downtown core, Vlad's or Hog's Grill, or the variety of different types of small-scale restaurants and food service stands that have popped up over time, and we've always said, well, put some chairs out so we can say that you're catering to on-premise consumption. and because we didn't want to get in the way of those activities. I mean, it just seemed like that's kind of a perfect pedestrian environment for that kind of activity to occur. And as long as we had some chairs out there, we felt okay with them occurring. So we have kind of known for some period of time that we weren't sure if that made sense in the code. And we know the intent of the code in the CB district and the GB district is to promote a pedestrian focused environment, and that's why drive-throughs are conditionally permitted. Takeout, where you may have a lot of people coming and going by car, but a lot of these folks are pedestrian. A lot of them are pedestrians that are going to these businesses, and a lot of times it's students coming from downtown late at night on the way back home. And so, it was something that we personally supported, and so as long as we had some seating on site, we felt that was appropriate underneath the code. So it's been something we've been battering around that needs to be adjusted. We also have, and I included kind of in the packet, we have the publication that was put out by APA here. This was actually September of 2013, so last fall, dealing with the exact topic, and so we've had that kicking around the office for a while. And actually, I got the article in the Statesman came from Jeff Jones about 2 days before I got the call from Mills or the email talking about having this as an agenda item of discussion, and Jeff's trying to promote the idea of let's get this going in town. At the same time, I also included a copy of our vendors ordinance that appears in Chapter 11, and this really regulates vending in the public right-of-way. And so, hot dog cart, we have these activities happening oftentimes on weekend nights. We've had somebody coming down cooking pizza, parking in a parking spot and selling pizza off the street. We've got the hot dog cart, we've had the crepe stand, we've had
We've had a coffee cart on Main Street at one point.
Yeah, and that's been a while.
Sidewalk.
Yeah, that was in front of
in front of the Michael Bus at the time. Yeah.
And so this is an ordinance that regulates that type of commercial activity that's occurring on the public right of way, and we have generally just said if it was covered by this section, we weren't going to worry about the zoning code that may say that that activity may or may not be permissible. So, but this sets forth kind of the general parameters if you want to use the right-of-way, and there's really two different settings that this can occur. I mean, you can have taco trucks, food trucks, parked in the right-of-way and serving in the right-of-way. You can also have them in the court, as on the picture of the cover of the Portland article, where you have an entire lot that has 6 or 7 or 8 of these, or they can just be on private property. We had a taco truck show up on College for a while where they kind of even poured a little patio out there to park the truck up to. And a lot of folks have started in that, and then they graduate into a bricks and mortar restaurant. And it's just a way of them growing their business slowly with a reasonable capital entry cost. So we have generally, this is how the city has managed and addressed that type of activity that's occurring in the public right-of-way, and this is largely occurring in the Central Business District. I think probably 90% of the activity we've had, or permits that have been issued, are happening in the downtown core. So, our perspective has been that we wanted to, and kind of visioned as part of the code update, we'd go through the CB and the GB and probably eliminate that CU for takeout food service. But it did, what we hadn't really defined was how far do we really need to go into this subject. And you can see, if you've read through the APA, and it's a good resource, that many communities approach it in a variety of different ways with a variety of levels of regulation or rules, and that where you may see the greatest impact is where you have a concentration.
Yeah.
And then you get into a question of, it's seating where then you start to get into bathroom facilities or trash, because they're not just taking and going, or taking and go. They're staying and consuming on site. But when you have a concentration of them as well, I think you have other aspects. Now, I don't anticipate that it's happening in the near future, but that doesn't mean that's not something we may want to potentially promote. And a lot of times these can be good intervening temporary uses until a property develops. So if you look at like 6th and Jackson Corner, if you were to have 3 or 4 of these on there, that could be a good interim use that would be interesting and get people downtown and create some energy. So you could have those. We probably don't, personally, we don't want to make it any more difficult than it needs to be. And so on an individual case-by-case basis of somebody getting a vending permit and positioning themselves in the right-of-way, I don't know that we necessarily need to really regulate that, other than just to clarify maybe any conflict we may have in the section of the code that allows it, in the CB zoning code that kind of may or may not allow it. But you could go so we could just eliminate that conflict and then just let it happen, or if you wanted to go into a more intensive, we could define it, we could insert it as permitted use, we could establish standards for it. But I really don't want to make it overly burdensome in the approach. So, there are kind of a wide range, and the only time I think where it might end up in a situation where you'd want to have some better standards is where you had a concentration of them, where you would then want to try to provide sanitary facilities for customers and ensure that trash is collected. Individually, I think people will clean up their individual space, but if you collectively, may become this, whose responsibility is it? And so in that scenario or situation, maybe it would be good to have some general standards about having trash receptacles available and servicing them on as necessary, and keeping the site reasonably free from debris or garbage, and then making provisions for bathroom facilities where there was portable outhouses or permission to use adjacent available facilities that are within a reasonable distance. So there are a couple of ways we could look at it. We're not getting that concentration right now, but if we wanted to promote that and actively promote that, then having some general measures in place would make sense. And if you get a concentration, then you may engage in parking, but if it's in the downtown core, that probably won't be an issue. But those are some just general thoughts we've had internally.
Do you think Portland has portable toilets in that block?
Yeah, they've had to. They started very loose, and they're now starting to have to tighten up a little bit on their standards, and even to the extent of getting now bricks and mortar complaints against these folks, taking business. And It's starting to create a little bit of conflict in Portland. I think they're having to go back and refine it, and they have implemented some standards to have facilities available, but we're not going to be anywhere near that, and so I'm not as concerned about it. And if we had that problem, that'd be, I would generally say it's a good problem to have, and I don't want to make an overly burdensome process by any means. We just want to try to make sure it's clear that you can do it and it's permissible. And then if you get to a certain concentration, then we need to have maybe some general standards to ensure that it's kept up. And
it's interesting that New York has, of course, had street food forever, and on every corner. But toilets are not part of the deal, and so that it's a very important thing to buy this little black book where you know where the toilets in New York City are. But back in the day it was a big deal. But now that coffee shops have come, the book has almost drifted away, because all you have to do is just look down the street. Starbucks will take care of you.
Well, if you buy a product and get the code so you can get in.
McDonald's will take care of you.
It was interesting in Portland where they were here over spring break, and you had to buy a product and they had to give you the code because there were keypads on all the bathroom doors.
Yep, consider it a $3 pay toilet.
Yes.
Sure.
So, sense, folks, do you want to
Yeah, I think
give
one of the
staff some direction?
I agree with you. One of the most important things is to make it easy. Any kind of micro business development is good, I think. So I think in terms of an individual truck, the problem is pretty much solved itself. But yeah, I would think that 6th and Jackson is the prime spot to think of seeing 4 of them show up there. Mm-hmm. And I think when you do reach that point, I don't know if the bathrooms are that important a deal, because in Moscow it's really not hard to find one you can use. But I think the bigger problem might be the keeping the area clean. There may be some of the brick and mortar businesses, the restaurants and stuff, are going to complain. I mean, I think part of the deal in New York is the street food's always been there. So if you're going to be opening a restaurant, that's just a given. That's part of the competition. I think there's a good chance for some crankiness if it turns into a food.
Though it's highly regulated in New York.
Oh, yeah.
You don't just go out in the street and kind of look for a place. I mean, exactly the same people have been there for 10 years on that spot. Has anybody have we seen one recently? My most recent one I saw was in Othello. I was shocked to stop for gas and look down the street and see one in Othello.
Yeah, we've even lost the New York Johnny hot dog cart's gone. So.
Yeah. So
where did he go, I wonder?
He's still around, but he's just not doing anything. And he has another job.
So it seems like one of the big questions is what's the number, before we start kicking in requirements.
Well, the on private property versus in the right-of-way might be, at 6th and Jackson, there will be nobody in the right-of-way because you can't stop there. And you might depend on the owner to do something to try to keep their property.
And there are some general public nuisance laws within police regulations that can address those types of situations.
I mean, like I say, littering is the one that leaps to mind.
It has to be somewhat egregious to become, eligible for prosecution as a public nuisance. But I just don't know that it's going to be a significant issue. If it is, we can come back and address it.
What is litter like after every farmer's market? Does it really pretty much takes care of itself? I just haven't stayed around at the end of the day to see with a few little trailer eateries and things like that are around. Because everybody comes all the time, it seems like they're really quite fastidious people. I'm amazed at how hard they work.
And we have our city crews come and empty the trash receptacles and clean up at the end, and I don't think it's a big deal.
So, Bill, what would you would then bring us some proposed revision?
Yeah, if we wanted to go with the least extensive change, we would make some minor modifications to the GB and the CB are the two that have the limitation against the takeout or having that as a conditionally permitted use. I think we ought to modify that anyhow, and
I would think a majority of people wouldn't want to take it. Right. If they're walking somewhere.
I just, I think obviously, the thought is if it's takeout, that somebody's coming in a vehicle, and I think the majority of the customers in these instances are not necessarily in a vehicle. So in the lowest intensity, we would just make some minor adjustments to the CB and GB district to address that item, and that's all it really honestly would take at this point in time.
I'd recommend we would do that, actually, just that modest look and keep our eye out. I just don't think we're big enough to ever have much of an issue.
How about UMC? 6 and Jackson is not in CB.
Yeah, we didn't include that language. I'm going to go by memory here.
And then my other question would be, what about motor business? And my thought is, if you were at the Moscow Building parking lot at the right time, you might become part of a real trade of various builders making a run to Moscow Building and getting lunch in the same.
Yeah, and there's no prohibition against that in the motor business district, and there's no prohibition against it in the UMC. It's really just in the GBC.
Those two that we need to consider.
What happens, like the sunglass place that is on over by
on the highway and
on the highway?
The short term, we have not. Our zoning code currently does not address temporary uses, and that's what you'd say, like the fireworks stand, the Christmas tree sales, the velour blankets.
But they seem to be around for several weeks.
And the sunglass hut.
That's also on private property.
It is, but it'd be regulated by the zoning code anyways.
Under the vendor.
Well, it's retail. So from a general sense, it is still retail activity, and retail establishments are allowed uses in those areas.
Falls into Christmas tree deals, maybe.
It's still retail, and retail is allowed in the motor business district. And so we have not, although it's not in a structure or building or it's under a tent and it's there for 2 or 3 days, we have not got to the point of regulating fireworks stands or those types of you would generally regulate as temporary uses and get a temporary use permit for that type of commercial activity. If we had something that was permanent, perpetual like that, then we have to address it. We just haven't had one end up that way. We also have similar activities with nursery stands that come up seasonally, but they've never been a problem and not something we felt needed to be really highly regulated.
So I think the sense I heard was make some minor tweaks, bring it back to us.
Encourage it, don't break it.
Right.
That would be our goal.
I found it interesting that some communities actually had the reverse, that they would allow pick-up food but not on-site consumption because of the trash problem that sometimes occurs with that, and the city regulations to require restrooms in association with that. So we actually have the opposite of what some places are.
Right.
Trying to.
Yep.
Well, we're not going to become a Portland. Darn, it's unfortunate because I love to go over and wander around that square.
Oh yeah, the big food courts. They're amazing.
Well, I had 20 students there 2 weeks ago. It was raining so hard, we all walked right past the trucks and into the nearest sheltered restaurant.
They missed a good deal.
No, we were drenched.
All right, moving on. The introduction to this next one, number 8, an introduction to review of relevant criteria and standards. Back when we were working on the Harvest Ridge, the
Harvest Hills,
just east of Mountain View. person came up to me and said, "Oh, you always pass those things, you just rubber stamp them." And I thought, for our audience at home, I don't think we rubber stamp them. I think we think about them fairly carefully, but we have criteria that they may or may not understand, or may not like. And then for the fact, recognizing that we have two new members, Rebecca is not here tonight, I thought it was a chance for a little bit of professional learning at the same time. So I asked Bill, could you just help us understand how it is that we have these criteria and standards?
So we're going to start off with a few statutes. Just looking to Idaho Code, and specifically to the Local Land Use Planning Act, which is titled 6765, Title 67, Chapter 65 of Idaho Code, that really sets forth the requirement that land use decisions be supported and the decision be supported in writing. And so we're going to go through a couple different sections, and there's only a few that I'm going to, sentences here that I'm going to direct to. So the first one I'm sending out is really the 676535, which is approval or denial of any application to be based upon express standards and to be in writing. And this is really the fundamental requirement that the decisions have some criteria and that decision be made in writing. So starting off with the very first sentence, it states the approval or denial of any application required or authorized pursuant to this chapter shall be based upon standards and criteria which shall be set forth in the comprehensive plan, zoning ordinance, or other appropriate ordinance or regulation of the city or county. And then beginning under the next number 2 section, the approval or denial of any application required or authorized pursuant to this chapter shall be in writing and accompanied by a reasoned statement that explains that criteria and standards considered relevant, states the relevant contested facts relied upon, and explains the rationale for the decision based on the applicable provisions of the comprehensive plan, relevant ordinance and statutory provisions, pertinent constitutional principles, and factual information contained in the record. And so this is really the fundamental requirement under Idaho Code, that we have the reasoned statement in the criteria that we have in the code today. So that's the kind of the beginning part. There are different sections of the code that, as you get into others, that do make reference to criteria. This one I'm passing around is 676511, looking at the zoning ordinance. And so you have the requirement that the decisions be made in writing in the prior section. And then, depending upon the different types of land use actions, there's some language regarding some of the criteria or some of the things that should be evaluated. And I just wanted to kind of cover. So under 6511, under the zoning ordinance, if you look under item number A, it reads, requests for amendment to the zoning ordinance shall be submitted to the Zoning and Planning and Zoning Commission, which shall evaluate the request to determine the extent and nature of the amendment request. Particular consideration shall be given to the effects of any proposed zone change upon the delivery of services by any political subdivision providing public services, including school districts within the planning jurisdiction. Reference item number B below that starts that after considering the comprehensive plan and other evidence gathered through the public hearing process, the Zoning or Planning and Zoning Commission may recommend and the governing board may adopt or reject an ordinance amendment pursuant to the notice and hearing procedures provided. So it's providing some guidance that the comprehensive plan and other evidence are items to be considered as part of that process. And then on the back of the page, under item number C, it reads, the governing board shall analyze proposed changes to zoning ordinances to ensure they are not in conflict with the policies of the adopted comprehensive plan. And so this is just providing some guidance of, as you look at your standards and criteria, these are a few of those elements to look at. And then you get into more specific, again, looking at variances under 6516. There's additional guidance given for criteria to variances, and about midway through this paragraph, it reads, a variance shall not be considered a right or special privilege, but may be granted to an applicant only upon a showing of undue hardship because of the characteristics of the site and that the variance is not in conflict with the public interest. And so, again, it's another bit of criteria to be considered as part of a variance application. And then one of the last references, and this one isn't quite as direct, under subdivision ordinances, under 676513, about the second sentence, it reads, it's talking about the adoption of a subdivision ordinance. Each such ordinance may provide for mitigation of the effects of subdivision development on the ability of political subdivisions of the state, including school districts, to deliver services without compromising quality of service delivery to current residents or imposing substantial additional cost upon current residents to accommodate the proposed subdivision. And so you're looking at some criteria about the ability to mitigate the impact and not imposing additional costs upon the community. So those are some of the more direct references under the Local Land Use Planning Act, giving some guidance both, I guess, in general, that all decisions are to be based upon clear standards and criteria. And then as you look at zoning changes or variances, there are some different nuances that exist based upon whether it's a hardship or a special privilege or not that need to be taken into consideration.
So to define a hardship, is it just like simply financial loss could be a hardship? Or
it could be. Typically, on a variance, you're really looking at the fact that the strict application of the zoning standards would deny them a right commonly enjoyed by other properties similarly situated in the same zoning district. So it's not just necessarily financial, although that can be a component of it, but it's really about the right of use of property that everybody else has that ability to enjoy, and somehow they're denied that based upon something that's unique circumstance about the property, its size, the shape, the topography. So it's hard to really, the hardship is really about they're just being denied, to place a modest home on a lot because it just falls off the mountainside. And strict application of setbacks or whatever is driving the placement of the home really makes it cost prohibitive and prevents that opportunity. And so some relief from that standard to allow them to enjoy what everybody else enjoys is appropriate. So from that, and I did include copies of the relevant criteria that we have in place that we are currently utilizing in the packet, the city has developed our reason statement, relevant criteria, and standards. And these are our old forms, but they were just handy and they had the criteria on them. As you know, today we do this is what we used to use. We used to use these. They would go through, and let's say if you were looking at a zoning change, for example, it would just say is not, it would get circled, is would get circled, is not would get circled, and then it would get signed. And you may not have a lot of facts that have been documented, conclusions that have been supported, and so we shifted, and then you're obviously the body's trying to author this at 11 o'clock at night, blurry-eyed and on the spot. So we shifted how we do it. You direct staff to do it. We prepare it. We include facts from the hearing, from the record. We make conclusions, and then we support the decision. And that's how we do the reason statements right now. But these documents contain the criteria. The interesting thing is that the criteria for a conditional use permit or a special use permit, and they're essentially the same, those do exist in the code, in the city code, and have been incorporated. Zoning variance criteria do exist in the city code. The criteria for subdivision plat is not in the code itself, nor is the zoning district boundary change criteria. And that's kind of an interesting, as you look at the language within the very first section of Idaho Code, talks about establishing the criteria in the zoning ordinance. We don't necessarily have all of our criteria in the zoning ordinance, so it's hard for me to understand the origin of where they came from. And that's part of the question I think Mills was, where these came from, how do we get to them, how do we use them, are they the right criteria to be utilizing? And so, I do know that those for the special use permit, conditional use permit, and variance have been in the code since at least '91, and we had a prior version prior to that. The subdivision plat criteria and the zoning district boundary change appear to have been generated but never codified that I can see in the code today. So that's something that we'll want to correct as part of the process. We also, and I'm just going to pass these around, you don't have to look at them tonight, and you can look at them at your leisure. These are copies of similar criteria from Coeur d'Alene, Twin Falls, Boise, Post Falls, Pullman, Missoula, and Spokane. But just to give kind of a sense of comparison of different criteria that other communities utilize, and you'll see that they're kind of all over the board. There's a lot of similarities. Obviously, the comprehensive plan is something that's referenced in the Idaho municipalities. But other than that, you see kind of somewhat of a wide variety, even in variances. And the one thing that really does stand out, if you were to just look at the variance criteria, variance criteria that are currently adopted by the city are fairly strict. They're fairly restrictive. And if you were just to take Coeur d'Alene, for example, there are 3 criteria for a variance. The first is there is an undue hardship because of the physical characteristics of the site. The second is the variance is not in conflict with the public interest. And the third is granting of said variance will be in conformance with the comprehensive plan. So those are their criteria. Ours are, 1, the first is special conditions or circumstances exist which are peculiar to the property and which are not applicable to other properties similarly situated in the same zoning district. Second is because of the aforementioned special conditions or circumstances of the property, application of the provisions of the zoning code would impose undue hardship and deprive the property owner of rights commonly enjoyed by owners of other properties similarly situated in the same zoning district. 3, the special conditions and/or circumstances of the property are not the result of the actions of the applicant or the property owner. The 4th is granting the variance will not confer special privilege to the subject property that is denied other similarly situated property in the same zoning district. And the 5th is granting the variance is in conflict with the public interest or injurious to property or persons in the vicinity of the subject property. Somewhat similar, one of the interesting ones is the actions are not the result of the actions of the applicant, is one that is, you tend to bump up against oftentimes when you're looking at a variance request. Coeur d'Alene also looking at special or conditional use permit. There's only 3 criteria. The first is the proposal in conformance with the comprehensive plan. The second is the design and planning of the site is compatible with the location, setting, and existing uses on adjacent properties. And the third is the location, design, and size of the proposal are such that the development will be adequately served by existing streets, public facilities, and services. You look at our criteria for conditional use permit. The first is the proposed use will not endanger the public health or safety if located where proposed and will not result in conditions which tend to generate nuisances, or any potential nuisances will be appropriately mitigated. The second is the proposed use meets all applicable development standards of the zoning code, including building height, setback, parking, use limitations, landscaping, and performance standards. 3, the proposed use will not be injurious or detrimental to adjoining properties or the neighborhood. 4, and this is the interesting one, the proposed use is a public necessity and is justified by the applicant and deemed by the Board of Adjustment to be of benefit to the public. 5th, the character of the proposed use, if developed according to the plan as submitted, will be in harmony with the area in which it is to be located. 6, the proposed use will not endanger the public health or safety. And 7, the proposed use will not be in conflict with the comprehensive plan.
So that would be a process of finding that my apartment building that's too big or too whatever is a public necessity.
Yeah. And that's
in that it provides housing or something.
Yeah, and that's always been an interesting criteria. How is one private property's development proposal a public necessity? It does fit in some instances where you're talking about, a nursing home or a care facility or a police station or, fire station. It's easy in those instances, but an individual property owner that wants a type 2 home occupation where they have to get a conditional use permit because they're going to have either on-site customer service or they're going to have an employee on-site. How was that? We did one, 30 months ago for a gunsmith working out of his house. How is that a public necessity? It's just a criteria that I think is not necessarily probably the best there.
Well, it says is or is not, and if it says is not, but is justified. Depends on what you circle there.
It does, and it's either a necessity or it needs to benefit the public. And how does a individual gunsmith benefit the public? And we always make the case, well, it'll provide for gunsmithing services to the community, and it was something like that. But it's kind of a difficult test, I think, and I'm not sure it's maybe the most appropriate.
You say this is based on Moscow ordinance?
Now, this is codified, so the conditional use permit and the special use permit criteria are codified, and these are just worksheets that have been developed based upon those. We do have a couple that aren't necessarily codified on the zoning amendment and subdivision itself. Anyhow, I just want to provide those. You can take some time, maybe between now and next meeting, to look and review or have a conversation now, and we can take it from there.
And I think I hear you saying that there are a couple that are not codified, and probably in the rework of the zoning
Yes.
codes, we need to capture them.
Yes.
Well, I want to start by thanking you for much more in-depth approach to the question than...
Sorry.
No, that's not what I need. But then the other thing that I learned...
Unless you want an answer.
that I learned from Art was one of the roles of chair is to try to keep track that the chair is eliciting from the commission enough comments that when we then direct staff to write the reason statement, it's in the record that we generally talked about these various headings, so that before we've taken a vote, we've actually covered the ground. And so I've come to understand that that's one of the roles of facilitating, of the chair facilitating that part of the hearing, is to try to, did we talk about this? And because a couple of times Art would say, why? You know, and just to try to, you can't make that claim without backing it up. And at first I got a little argumentative with him, and then I realized, no, he's just trying to get it in the record.
But just for our new members,
Other times he was just messing with you.
you should know that years ago, we would always write these, and I always remember when Mike Curley was on, he was one of our really fast-write lawyers, and it was painful, because writing these things takes a few minutes, maybe a half an hour of your time. If you've got the materials right there by you, you actually would sit down. But here we were trying to do it in front of the public. It seemed at 11 o'clock at night, it seemed rather strange, and I remember in order to get around that, Curley was one of these guys that on the first 3 minutes of the meeting, he was already writing, and so when we got to it, he'd say, oh, how does this sound? You know, and we might change a word, but it was really, it wasn't very edifying to the public, and it caused, I think it causes a commission to, you don't really need to do that private work in front of everybody. The discussion needs to be there, absolutely. We want to cover all the bases, but it's been very refreshing to not write those at 11 o'clock at night, and I can't tell you how that's kept me on the commission now for another 10 years. That was always worrisome.
All right. Thank you. The next item is a request for some information on my part to you. 4 or 6 weeks ago, I brought to you the topic of water in Moscow, the PBAC agreements, and your request was for some additional information. I've started to identify that. Bill has been identifying some resources also. The question is, do you want that in the form of some links to readings, or would you like some of that in the form of someone who comes and gives us a 15-minute presentation who you could then quiz?
Like the 15-minute presentation.
B.
Okay,
I like the links to readings. I like the opportunity to dig into it a little more.
a little more time, okay.
It doesn't have to
I don't-
be one or the other.
I don't think it has to be exclusive, right. If nobody wanted to take the 15 minutes of, the people I've asked to give something, I can't give it short. Well, I'm going to, you are going to give it short, but, okay. So
When you've said water background information, I'm presuming I know what you mean, but help me just a little
I
bit.
think you may have not been present.
Yeah,
at
I've
the
been,
meeting.
I've missed a couple
Missed a
meetings.
couple. I raised a question to the commission regarding, did the commission wish to request further direction from council, in that right now we are operating under, there are two limits to, in our PBAC agreement, the Palouse Basin Aquifer Committee pumping agreement. One limit is that the amount that we can pump rises each year until it reaches 125% of where it started, in which case it goes horizontally from then on. That 125%, that turn from a sloping graph to a horizontal graph, happens, I think it's 3 years from now. We are currently operating below the curve. But staff has identified that we have enough land currently in the city that's unbuilt, that's zoned, platted, and unbuilt, that if we then say, how much does the typical R1 lot use? And we look at our water commitment to all of that, because presumably if you have a lot in town, you're going to, when you build on it, you're going to get water service. We have a commitment to those lots. That commitment exceeds the 125%. We're not there yet. It may take us 5 years to build out to get there. And the good news is, it's only a political problem. In that the water will continue to run when we overpump that commitment. Our water rights, legal rights are there. The wells, while declining, continue to produce. So what interested me about it was a tripwire coming up in an agreement between the PBAC participants, without it being a tripwire coming up that was an actual failure to deliver water. So it seemed like it was a good time to have the conversation before it got more severe. Anyway, in that conversation, the commission asked for more information about the whole package of things. We have some proposals out there for surface water solutions at various price tags, what the aquifer is doing or not doing, part of the story. Anyway, so I was going to organize some more information for you to provide more.
As the water summit comes up each year, it seems to me that it'd be really smart to get with the planners of it. I'm not saying it isn't covered, but take a couple hours of the water summit, or depending on how long, sometimes we have a day and a half and sometimes we only have a day of the water summit, but I think it should, this is a critical issue that needs to be focused on in even a broader than outside, and then it would be like mandatory for us to be at that water summit. I try and make every water summit, but I'm not convinced I know where we're going yet, even with all the brilliance that's out there. And so anyway, but these specifics relating to our own city and how we're going to deal with that, the promises to keep, I think should be discussed in a broader forum, and the Water Summit seems to be the likely place to do it.
I will take that and explore that also. Great.
Yeah, I think we all are going to, will come a day when our children are going to say we didn't do a very good job, I think. It's worrisome.
When your well goes dry, as mine did 2 years ago, it really catches your attention.
Yeah. We just don't, I grew up in that floodplain down there in Boise where water was 10 feet under the, and a 50-foot well was a big deal. And when you tell people in Boise that we have 600-foot wells, they look at you and their eyes get big. You have no idea what you're talking about. Right. 2,000.
Down to sea
Going down to
level.
the Clearwater, basically.
Thank you, I've got some more direction there. Last item, number 10, review of the fiscal year 15 commission budget request.
It is budget time, again, and I kind of gave a brief overview of the budget. This was just the budget request we had for last fiscal year, so it is time to take a look at the request of what the commission would like to submit for the upcoming 15 fiscal year. As reported, there was $1,500 that was allocated in the current fiscal year, and we have spent about $86 and some change to date. So, we need to probably work on identifying. AIC used to do the traveling show, giving updates on land use actions and training to commission members, and they have kind of somewhat reduced that level of activity. I haven't seen a schedule for the current year, but there is a little bit of expense associated with that. But at this point in time, we have not, due to the level of, we've had one or two commission members show up, and that was even when we were jointly sponsoring the audio web conferences with the APA, with Latah County, and inviting their commission and their staff. I guess I've found that most of their presentations have not been that outstanding. They rarely get to the level of detail that we really would like to know. They tend to stay at the very high level, and so I've not been, it hasn't blown my socks off. I've only had maybe one that was kind of a good one. And so we somewhat moved away from hosting those because they were like $300 per. And so at this point in time, we haven't engaged any more of those. So anyhow.
Let's try to escape.
John, I think you got it.
She's health on a restaurant, it'd be kind of cold. Anyhow, so we don't have to make a decision tonight. Just wanted to hand out the prior request, ask you to think about it, and then as we come back to the meeting next week, I'd like to try to formalize a proposal. So that's all I want to do tonight.
What happens to the unused portion of the budget?
Anything that is unexpended in the budget, and typically most line items are unexpended. There's a few that are overexpended, but so at the end of the end of the fiscal year, those funds generally are allocated to capital projects and fleet. So they're, we have the revenues that are coming in, the tax revenues, and if we underexpend, then anything that's left over is then moved into fund balance and usually gets allocated out to capital projects. So if we don't do the conference, you may end up paving 6 inches of Mountain View. That saving. So
that survey is costing us pavement, huh?
Yeah, maybe. But no, it is those unanticipated, underexpended line items do get moved into fleet, and they buy fire engines and fleet vehicles, or go to capital projects, and that's generally what occurs with that money.
Sort of from the commission's viewpoint, it's use it or lose it.
It is, but I don't. I use it responsibly. Is always. If there's not a good use of it, then there will be other good uses made of it. And so, that's not to say that the survey is not a good use of the funds.
All right, so ponder it, and I guess in my mind the question is, are there professional learning things that you would like? We used to subscribe to something, we don't. We're trying to use the online readings as a substitute for that. Maybe something else. Nels, you have bought us a book on more than one occasion, I believe.
And that's something we could look into.
Again, so
I've probably spent that budget a couple times just out of my own pocket, so it's sort of a silly little budget. in a way, but I believe your thoughts about educating ourselves is really good. And it's not only good, I believe necessary. We did, I know Lambert and I had, years ago, we did another, you have spurts of wanting to get educated, and then you want to just let things go. And we had some movies and books and things, and we really had some good fun. And at least that's how I got to know Bill, and I became really close at that time, because I think it's a good thing for us to get involved in some issues that Bill doesn't necessarily bring to us as just the normal work, but issues that we get to talk about. And I'm like him. I've gone to planning conferences all my life, and so often you can spend $500 or $600 at a conference, and it just doesn't bear a lot of fruit. And though I think that back to the water conference, I think the guys in town that sponsor that and try and make it happen, that's a real useful conference that doesn't cost a lot of money, and it's really critical. But I commend your efforts to try and inspire us to do a little extra reading.
Thank you. And it seems that right now we have the luxury of not doing a rezone every 2 weeks or some other land use action.
Right.
So working on the comprehensive, or not on the comprehensive plan, but on the zoning, which is a good use of our time, I think. And then the other I thought was, well, we can squeeze in some learning in and around those other things. Okay, so you will ponder what you would like to do with the budget proposal for our next meeting. Anything else for the good of the order? Adjourned.
Thank you.